We are talking today with Michael T. Klare. He is Professor of Peace and World Security Studies at Hampshire College and Defense Correspondent at The Nation. He is also author of numerous books, including Resource Wars, and his most recent book, Blood and Oil, The Dangers and Consequences of America's Growing Petroleum Dependency. Michael, thank you for spending time with us today.
It's my pleasure.
If I could begin and ask you about some of the ideas around your current book, Blood and Oil. When you're talking about blood, whose blood are we discussing?
Well, I begin with the blood of American soldiers, and the essence of my argument is that America's foreign oil dependency is being militarized by the U.S. government. That is, we're relying on military force to protect our access to foreign oil, oil supplies are increasingly at risk because more and more of it's coming from dangerous areas in the developing world, the Middle East and Africa and Latin America. And our government has chosen to respond to this challenge by sending troops over there to try to protect it. So those soldiers are being put at risk. So that's the beginning of it. But inevitably, as they get drawn into conflicts there, other people's lives are also at risk. And Iraq is a good example of this. I mean, American soldiers are certainly suffering, and I feel very bad that that's the case, that they're being put at risk this way. But other people are also being slaughtered in the conflict there. So, and I do see oil as a key feature in that conflict. So that's where the blood comes from.
And in terms of the dangers and consequences, maybe you can talk about some of the dangers. Is Iraq also a good example of the dangers that we are facing going into places where clearly people probably don't want us there?
Absolutely. And you have to understand that oil has always been associated in the Middle East and elsewhere with the penetration by foreign companies, oil companies. Originally the British and the Russians and the French and now the United States. So the very presence of these oil companies in these countries is to some an intrusion of the West, an intrusion of the United States, of imperialism. A lot of these countries have a history of being colonized, so they don't like anything that smacks of imperialism. So the very fact that we're pursuing oil in these countries is a source of resentment for some and hostility. And for some people, this takes violent form, and it takes the form of terrorism.
Again, looking towards the Middle East, you've been obviously covering this issue for years. Did you see Iraq and our moves into there as something that was inevitable?
Absolutely. And I see Iraq really not as an event unto itself, but as a continuation of a long policy of American military involvement in the Persian Gulf. This goes back a long ways. It goes back to the days of Franklin Roosevelt, because he was the first American president to form an alliance with one of these Gulf kingdoms, Gulf oil countries, Saudi Arabia. He personally forged the bond with the House of Saud in 1945. And every American president since Roosevelt has reasserted that relationship with the House of Saud and then later with other oil kingdoms in the Middle East. So there's a long history of this and a long history of using military force to protect the flow of oil from the Middle East. It's President Carter, Jimmy Carter in 1980, who issued the Carter Doctrine, which says that we will use military force if necessary to protect the flow of petroleum. And that was the basis upon which President Bush Sr., the first President Bush, announced the U.S. decision to use force in the first Persian Gulf War in 1990. So I see what happened in Iraq in 2003 as really a continuation of that process, not as something new, separate from that history, but deeply embedded in that history of U.S. military involvement around oil in the Persian Gulf.
So in addition to the Persian Gulf, the U.S. has been moving into regions like the Caspian Sea basin as well, and that hasn't been getting as much attention. It has been getting a little attention. Can you talk about that?
This began really in the Clinton era. The Soviet Union broke up in 1992. And then it became possible for the first time for U.S. oil companies to go into the Caspian region, because up until that time it was all part of the Soviet Union. Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Georgia, they were all republics of the former USSR, and they were closed off to the United States. But after the Soviet Union broke up and they became independent countries, it became possible for American companies to go into the Caspian to exploit its oil and natural gas. And President Clinton was a big fan of this move. He supported this effort by American companies because he wanted to reduce our total dependence on the Middle East. On the Persian Gulf proper, because that area was so dangerous. He said, let's go into the Caspian, and it gives us another alternative, another option to Persian Gulf oil. So Clinton was the sponsor of the initial U.S. connection with the Caspian Sea states in the late 1990s, and he made the first arrangements for U.S. troops to be able to use bases in the Caspian Sea area. Now, after 9/11, those bases became a lot more important, and President Bush sent more American troops in there and expanded on these ties, and all in the name of anti-terrorism. But the initial U.S. military ties with Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan and Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan preceded 9/11, and it had oil as its basis, not terrorism.
And are there other regions that we're looking at where the U.S. is expanding into now?
Absolutely. One of the areas that I follow and I worry about is Colombia. Now, we were told originally that troops had to go into Colombia to help in the war against drugs, but that's changed in the past few years. Now, American troops are going into Colombia to protect oil pipelines and oil facilities under Plan Colombia. And there are 100 or so special forces types helping to guard, with Colombian forces, helping to guard the main oil pipeline in the north, the Caño Limón pipeline, which connects to Occidental Petroleum's oil fields. And there's more of this activity underway. So we're getting more and more deeply ingrained into the conflict in Colombia with oil as the driving force.
And are we also putting in bases into all the places that we are trying to acquire the oil from?
Yes, we are. Certainly in the Caspian Sea, we now have a few bases in the Caspian Basin in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, and the Department of Defense is looking to the establishment of new bases in Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. And I think it's only a matter of time before we have bases there. There are also American soldiers in Georgia, the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, on the ground helping Georgian forces protect the new oil pipeline from the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean, the so-called BTC pipeline for Baku, Tbilisi, and Ceyhan in Turkey. Also in Africa, we're just beginning to seek out and establish military bases in sub-Saharan Africa. It's unclear exactly where these bases will be located. The Pentagon has been looking at a bunch of possible locations, so I can't be sure exactly where they'll be. Cameroon, Ghana, maybe, the offshore islands of Sao Tome and Principe, former Portuguese colony. This will be announced over the coming months and years, but it's clear the Pentagon is moving more and more troops into the oil field areas.
And are these welcomed facilities by the places where they're and the people that are near them?
That depends on the country and who you talk to. Obviously in Colombia, there are many people who are very bitter at the presence of American troops. And in Georgia, which I worry about a great deal, we are very closely aligned with the government of Georgia, which claims also the areas known as Abkhazia and South Ossetia. These are ethnic areas. They're Muslim areas. The Georgian population is predominantly a Christian population, but there are two predominantly Muslim areas in Georgia which have fought with the Georgian government to establish their own ethnic autonomous states, especially in Abkhazia. There's a ceasefire underway right now, but that could blow up at any minute. And the fact that we're so closely associated with the Georgian government puts American soldiers at risk of being caught up in these inter-ethnic wars in the Caucasus region.
It seems like a lot of the places where we've been putting in bases, let's say in the last 10 years, are places that are in relatively total turmoil or are very close to exploding.
Well, there's a good reason for that. That is that the oil countries are just inherently unstable, and that's because it's not because there's something inherently wrong with the people there, but that the production of oil itself tends to stir up all kinds of resentments and conflicts, partly, as I say, because of its association with imperialism. You know, the British first came into Iraq after World War I, and now, you know, the British are back with the United States. The British came in for oil. We look as if we're there for oil. We could have a debate about whether that's true or not, but certainly many, many people in Iraq think that we're there for oil. There's a lot of statistical evidence to show that, and so they resent the presence of American troops. At least those people have been demonstrating against the U.S. presence in Iraq. I know not everyone feels that way, but there is a lot of anti-American resentment. So that's part of the problem. Another part of the problem is that these oil countries, I call them petro regimes, tend to be ruled by authoritarian governments that seek to retain control over the oil wealth, like military juntas in Nigeria or ex-KGB dictatorships in Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, it's the House of Saud. We're very closely tied with the House of Saud. The House of Saud is trying to retain control over all of that oil wealth, and they spend it in very conspicuous ways. This is a deeply Islamic country. So that very fact of the accumulation of wealth by these elites stirs up all kinds of ethnic and political and religious unrest, and it targets those regimes. And we are associated with the House of Saud and some of these other governments, and that makes us a target too. If you look at the recruiting propaganda for Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, you'll see that that's exactly what they talk about in recruiting the disgruntled, angry young men who have joined al-Qaeda and pose such a threat to us. It's exactly this notion that the U.S. is propping up this corrupt, un-Islamic, immoral, whatever, regime, the House of Saud, and that's really the backdrop to 9/11.
Have you seen any correlation between the U.S. bases that go in and oil? Do you ever see, for instance, U.S. bases going in for things other than local resources?
Certainly during the Cold War period, there was a different kind of conception of military power. There the guiding notion was containment, and that meant surrounding the Soviet Union with bases on all of its perimeters. That was the essence of the strategy of containment. It was not an offensive strategy. It was a kind of a defensive strategy, but to try to build a wall around the Soviet Union. So if we had a map and we had the borders of the old Soviet Union on that map, you would see on every perimeter country there were American bases at one time or another. Some of those bases are still there, but some of them are being given up now because under the under the Rumsfeld base reallocation plan, realignment plan, we're moving away from that defensive posture to a much more offensive, aggressive posture of thrusting American power into these unstable areas that contain a lot of oil. So there's a massive historic shift taking place, and the center of gravity of American military power from the perimeter of the Soviet Union in Western Europe and in Asia to Central Asia, the Middle East, and to Africa.
And I believe you've written about how some of these newer bases are smaller. In fact, the U.S. military doesn't even like to call them bases. They have other names for them.
That's right. Forward operating locations is one of them. Bunch of euphemisms. And, you know, you could understand that. The bases in Europe, that we had developed during the Cold War period over decades and decades are very elaborate. They have hospitals and housing for dependents and movie theaters and bowling alleys. Well, we can't afford that right now, but that's only part of it, the economic part of it. The other part of it is that in the Cold War period, you had a very good idea of where the enemy forces you might have to fight against are located. We assumed that if a war broke out, it would happen in central Germany, in the plains of Germany, that their tanks would come across the border and towards Frankfurt. So we had bases there to stop that incursion if it were to occur. That made a certain amount of sense. Right now, you can't have that degree of certainty about where the next upheaval will be. Is it Pakistan? Is it Afghanistan? Is it Uzbekistan? Is it Nigeria? We just can't be sure. So they want to pepper the entire region with these operating facilities that could be used overnight. They may be nobody there one day, and the next day you could move in troops and equipment and quickly establish a presence in this country. So they have this in mind, to have many of these facilities scattered throughout the region so you could pick and choose when you need to where you're going to concentrate your strength.
Seems like also, though, that those would be ripe for local forces that weren't friendly to the U.S. to go in and grab what they wanted when we weren't there.
Of course, there's that possibility, but there'll be very little there on a permanent basis. There'll be very modest facilities, so they won't have the same attraction for that purpose. And again, remember, keep coming back to the fact all these areas were once under the control of one of the imperial powers, Britain or France or Russia at one time or another, or the Ottoman Empire, and the people there have a very deep, abiding mistrust of and resentment towards colonial powers. So if the U.S. were to come in and set up a very big, elaborate bases with perimeter fences and costly, shopping malls and golf courses and like you have in Germany, this would stir up a lot of resentment because it would look a lot like colonialism. So they're trying to go in the opposite direction. They call them bare bones facilities, very little to arouse that kind of anti-imperial sentiment.
All right, well, as if the U.S. Was the only kid on the block, they're not. Obviously, we have now China, which I'm not sure, maybe you can clarify exactly how much oil compared to the U.S. China is currently consuming and is going to consume, and what their aspirations are for.
Yes, this is a very important question. China has the fastest growing economy in the world. They need more and more energy. They want more oil and natural gas to supply their economic engine. And so they too are looking for foreign sources of oil. Now, they have a long way to go before they'll catch up with the United States. And, we need to be clear about that. We now use about 20 million barrels a day. I think China is now using 6 or 7 million barrels a day, and they have a population 5 times ours. So the ordinary average American uses about 20 times the amount of oil on a per capita basis as the average Chinese citizen. So it'll be a while before they catch up with us. But they are looking to some of the same areas, the Middle East, the Caspian Sea, and Africa as a source of oil. And they too are coupling this with military aid, with military sales, with advisors. They haven't established too many bases the way the U.S. has outside of their own territory, but they are sending military advisors and weapons and beginning that process.
Yeah, I believe I heard just recently that China had been down in South America negotiating multiple deals there. I thought they did one with Venezuela.
Yes, they have been scouting the world for every source of oil they could get their hands on. Of course, bear in mind that the United States and France and Germany and Britain have been there, and Japan have been there for a long time before them, and a lot of those fields have already been bought up by American companies and Japanese companies. So the Chinese are the new kids on the block. They're trying to elbow their way in, find a little bit of oil, and they are going to places that the U.S. looks at with disfavor to some degree, because that's where they have an opening, like Sudan. The United States has not traded with Sudan because of its human rights practices, the wars that are underway, and this created an opening for China to move in, and now China is the leading developer of oil in Sudan. And they have accompanied this with some very dubious activities. There are reports that the Chinese have built air bases that are being used by the Sudanese military for attacks on some of the rebel groups, especially in the south where the oil is. So China is complicit this way with the Sudanese government with some of the human rights abuses that have occurred. So this is a very disturbing phenomenon.
And how about Russia as well? The U.S. is moving into, former satellite countries.
Yes, this is a source of tremendous discontent in Russia. Russia's interest is a little different than China. China has a growing economy and it needs more oil, and it's out there trying to get its hands on as much new oil as it possibly can. Russia's a little different. Russia has enough oil and gas for its own purposes. But Vladimir Putin, the president, wants to establish some kind of Russian hegemony over the areas that were once part of the former Soviet Union. I'm not going to say he has a plan to recreate the Soviet Union or the Tsarist Empire, but I think there is an attitude in Moscow that these areas like Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan were once part of the Russian sphere of influence and belong in the Russian sphere of influence, and they're going to use whatever means they can to reassert Russian control, or not control, but influence and hegemony in that area. And they too are using military means for that purpose, sending troops, building bases. There are Russian troops and bases in Georgia and Armenia, in Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, in some cases cheek and jowl by U.S. bases and forces. Very unusual situation. So they're all competing. The U.S., China, and Russia are all competing for geopolitical influence in this fundamentally unstable area. Just this week there have been riots and fighting in Uzbekistan, for example, and there's periodic fighting in Georgia. So it's an unstable area to begin with, and on top of that you have three great powers vying with one another for influence. This is a very dangerous game they're playing.
So what do you think is going to happen?
Well, what I think is going to happen is that we're going to be in a world of continuous crisis. Some of that crisis will simmer down or will be resolved through negotiation, but some of it may not be. For example, the situation with respect to Iran is very unstable right now. The Iranians claim they have a right to develop nuclear technology for peaceful purposes. The United States says that they want that not for peaceful purposes, but to make nuclear weapons. We're demanding that they agree to abandon their nuclear program. The Iranians say they're not. The U.S. says we're going to go to the UN Security Council if they don't and impose sanctions on Iran. Iran says we'll resist that in any way we can. This is a very explosive scenario waiting to happen. It's unresolved. Nobody could say what would happen. But a war with Iran is not out of the question at this point, or military strikes on their nuclear facilities. And Iran could respond by stirring up all kinds of hornets' nests in Iraq, for example, or in Lebanon, or in the territories controlled by Israel in the West Bank and Gaza. They have ways of responding. So we're in a very dangerous trajectory here.
So if you were in charge, what would you be recommending for U.S. energy policy?
Well, U.S. energy policy now is geared to continually increasing the supply of oil in this country, to provide more and more of it. And that is embedded in the energy policy adopted by the Bush-Cheney administration in 2001, the Cheney Task Force, said our job is to increase the supply of oil. Well, the only way you could do that is to go to foreign countries and get it, to these dangerous, unstable countries we're talking about. Yes, they say we could also go to ANWR in Alaska, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. But they know, and everybody else knows, there's not enough oil in Alaska to make a real difference. If we're going to increase the supply of oil, it has to come from Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, and put us at greater and greater risk. So what has to change is to move away from increasing to supply to reducing demand. That has to be the main theme of American policy. Reduce the demand for petroleum through conservation, through energy efficiency, by requiring that vehicles on the road, future vehicles, be far more fuel efficient than they are now, by requiring SUVs to have the same fuel efficiency standards as ordinary automobiles. Right now they have a free pass, pretty much, on gasoline efficiency. That has to stop. So my thrust would be to try to reduce the amount of petroleum that Americans use every day. Therefore, we'll be less exposed to the risks intended upon, going after oil in the Middle East.
Any final thoughts you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, my sense is that we're entering a period now where oil may prove to be less plentiful than it was in the past. This is a combination, on one hand, of the fact that the capacity of the oil industry to keep increasing supplies year after year may be diminishing. I'm not saying we're about to run out of oil, although some people think that's the case, but I think the supply won't continue to increase the way it has in the past. At the same time, demand is increasing enormously, not only from the U.S., but now increasingly from China and India and other developing nations. So this means the competition for what's left of the world's oil is going to get more intense. And in this period of increased demand, more and more competition, increasingly fierce competition, this is when this kind of geopolitical game we've been talking about heats up and gets more dangerous. So that's what I worry about, is growing competition for a diminishing pool of petroleum. And we have to be, therefore, much smarter about conserving the supply of oil in this country, using it more prudently, cutting back on our driving and our use of fuel-inefficient vehicles so that we're less at risk in this intensely competitive era that we're about to enter.
Michael T. Klare, I want to thank you for spending time with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We've just been talking with Michael T. Klare. He is Professor of Peace and World Security Studies at Hampshire College and defense correspondent with The Nation magazine. He is also author of Resource Wars and his most recent book, Blood and Oil: The Dangers and Consequences of America's Growing Petroleum Dependency.